Today we're going to learn about angle of engagement, which is another subject that's often difficult to describe verbally, but is easy to explain once you can actually see it happening. Today we're going to be using just random parts out of my parts box, so not everything is made to fit perfectly. Like this brass bushing doesn't really fit the shell just right because it doesn't go down and flush, but disregard that because what's important is the principles we're learning. This is standard version 2, just a old Area 1000 piston, random gear, but you can see how everything sits here. And the purpose of the angle of engagement is fairly simple. It usually involves 2 steps, and in one step there's 2 methods to do it, or at least 2 normal methods. There might be others. So let me go ahead and show you. We get in close here. You can see that. So the sector gear comes up and makes contact with the back tooth. The angle at which this tooth on the sector gear hits the rear tooth on the piston is called the angle of engagement, and that's why this is called angle of engagement. So when it hits that, depending on the angle, that can increase or decrease the durability. If it hits it at this initial sharp angle where the 2 surfaces aren't really flush when they collide, that can cause your back tooth to wear out or become torn off prematurely, especially on pistons like this that has no lateral ridges to reinforce it. So we're going to correct that. Like I said, this is a 2-step process, and one of the steps has 2 methods to do it. Different people prefer different methods. The first thing that you have to do in order to make the angle of the tooth on the sector gear hit the tooth on the piston, instead of hitting like this, you want it to hit more flush like that. Well, in order to do that, the piston has to actually sit, when it's resting, a little bit further backwards. Well, that's the first step in the process, and there's 2 ways to do it. The first way to do it is the one I prefer, because it's actually killing 2 birds with 1 stone, and that is to put sorbethane padding on. See, this is a stock cylinder head. Actually, you can't see it too well. It's black, so it's not focusing right. So you can see a standard cylinder head. I'm sure you've all seen what they look like. If you put sorbethane padding on here, it will increase the thickness of it, which makes the piston in its resting position sit further towards the back of the shell. Here's a cylinder head that already has sorbethane on it, and you can see the difference there. So when this is resting on it, of course, the piston is sitting further rearward. Now, the reason I like this method is because, again, it kills 2 birds with 1 stone. It dampens not only the noise, but the amount of pressure on the gearbox when you put sorbethane on the cylinder head. So it's good for durability all the way around. Also dampens some of the noise signature, but it, again, corrects your angle of engagement. So let's explain the other way to do this first step before we move on. If you don't want to put sorbethane on your cylinder head, then the other method is to put shims between the piston head and the body of the piston. There's a lot of different things you can use, as long as it's something that's durable, it's not going to break apart or become loose or fall out. You can use almost anything as a shim. What I usually use when I have to use that method are these little sanding wheels. They're like a thin, they're very thin, it's just sandpaper is all it is, cut in a circle. But the beauty of it is they're about the right size, and all you have to do is cut a little larger hole out in the center. And once you cut that hole out, you can just slide them on the screw between the piston body and the piston head. And what that does is it makes the piston head, which is still going to be right up against the cylinder, it makes that distance a little longer, so the body of the piston, even though the piston head's in the same place, the body of the piston is further back. So again, correcting that angle of engagement. So again, you can use either of those 2 methods. They both work. Sorbethane kills 2 birds with 1 stone, which is why a lot of people prefer it. Sorbethane is great stuff. You can get it in a couple different densities. There's lots of threads that discuss benefits, pros and cons of densities. This is some sorbethane, heavily used. I think I got it from McMaster Car. But once you get it, it's really simple. Just take any old cylinder, preferably with a beveled edge. You can't really quite tell probably, but this cylinder is beveled downward like that, so it makes it almost a sharper edge right here. And what I'll do is I'll put it on a flat surface, and then, I'm out of frame there. I'll put it on a flat surface and put it up against the edge, and then I'll use like a large C-clamp or something like that, or even just put a block of wood and press down really firmly and just cut out a pad. And then all you got to do is take an X-Acto knife and cut out the right amount of space so that you're not blocking where the air goes out to the air nozzle. So you can see this is not blocked off. And then what I'll use to affix it, some people remove the padding, the stock padding on it. What I actually do is use a cyanoacrylate. So like Loctite makes, super glue that's just cyanoacrylate. But the cyanoacrylate adhesive actually melts both layers together. They're chemically fused. So this is not going to come off unless you rip the whole thing off. So those are the two methods of getting the piston to sit further back. Once you do that, you have a problem, and I'll show you what that problem is. I'm going to put this is the one with sorbethane. We'll put it in this cylinder here. Okay. All right, so now this piston is sitting where we want it to. That's great, right? So when the sector gear hits it, it should be at about the right angle. Now again, you may have to tweak it. If you want to tweak it to get it to hit at right flush, you can use those little spacers to get it to just the right angle. But when it comes in here, now what's going to happen? It's going to hit the second tooth. So now we have this closer view so you can see what I'm talking about. Now we have the piston sitting further back when it's resting position. So on the uptake, when the sector gear initially contacts it, it'll hit the back tooth at the right angle. But what's the problem we have now? That second tooth is colliding with this. Well, that's a big issue because it's either going to wear that down and rip it off, or it's going to try to cycle the piston one tooth too far forward. So what we got to do now is take a Dremel and knock off that second to last tooth, which is why you'll see a lot of stock pistons nowadays don't even come with a second to last tooth. But once we do that, you can see the angle that this tooth is colliding with the back tooth of the piston is almost perfect. And what that's going to do is again make it a lot less likely for you to wear out the teeth on your piston and also rip off the back tooth on your piston. That's why people fix the angle of engagement. There's an easy way to get rid of that tooth, and it's called a Dremel. There's a head that I like to use, which is this one. It's about the right thickness. So this is what I normally use for removing teeth. If you've never done it before, I would recommend taking the piston and making it stationary on something. You can clamp it down to the edge of a table with a C-clamp. Don't do it too hard. Obviously, you don't want to damage the teeth or warp anything or crack the polycarbonate. But if you have it held firm on the side of a table, then you can obviously with safety glasses on, get in close and see what you're doing and gently remove that tooth. So I'm going to take a minute now to remove this tooth. I'll go ahead and say that a lot of times the third to last tooth has to be shortened somewhat. In fact, I'll show you a steel tooth piston that's already had that done. You can see the last tooth is removed, and due to the angle of engagement on this one, I also had to remove the second last tooth about halfway, and this corrected it. In fact, this ran several tens of thousands of rounds in a DSG setup. You can see where the body is a little cracked from that duress, but that's okay because this is a steel rack, so it's held in here. Also, this entire rack is thoroughly bonded with the body with some adhesive because I didn't want it ripped out in that build. So this is actually still a perfectly functioning piston after that, and part of that is thanks to changing the angle of engagement. So we're going to do exactly this to the other piston. I'm not going to really remove a whole lot on this tooth on the other one because it didn't look like it was necessary. But I'll come back in a second with this piston, and you'll see the difference. So now you see what happens when we take off that tooth. It's totally missing. Again, this was done with a Dremel bit, and you can see where it's just been shaved off. It's not too difficult to do. If you have steady enough hands where you don't need to have it hooked to a table, what I would recommend, I usually back my chair up from the table and do it over the carpet. That way you can just vacuum up the shavings quickly. Also, of course, wear eye pro. You don't want little bits of polycarbonate all in your eyes. Again, this one, it didn't look like it was going to bump this tooth, so I didn't bother removing it yet. But what you want to do is, again, these are just random parts, so we're not going to do this. But when you're actually building a gearbox, you want to put everything in and leave the sector gear, not connecting with the piston, and then close everything up and then rotate it and see where it stops, because The piston, when it's sitting in the rails, you know, it could be sitting a little higher, could be sitting a little lower. Same thing with the sector gear, might be leaning a little this way. Well, it wouldn't really lean, but you know what I'm saying. Because the other side of the shell is not on, this is not necessarily precisely where these parts are going to sit. So if you want to do it right, you want to make sure that you put the other half of the shell on and test it and make sure that, you know, if this is a little lower, you're not hitting that tooth. We're not going to bother with that again because we're not actually building a gearbox. But now you can see the piston comes around, when the sector gear comes around, and it hits that tooth, there's nothing in its way, and so it can just keep going with it. So that's just about everything there is about angle of engagement.